The world's leading spaceflight powers have turned their attention to the moon in a way that we haven't seen since the late 1960s and early 1970s. But is America really in a moon race with China? Let's take a look at how and why we're going back to good old Luna, and whether this really is Cold War Moon Race Part 2 or something different. To find out if we're really in a new moon race, we have to roll back the clock a few decades and dive into some history. Now don't worry, I won't make you sit through a long and boring history lesson, though space is never boring, but we do need some context. After the Apollo 17 astronauts returned home from the moon in 1972, NASA shifted its focus to low Earth orbit, first with the Skylab space station, followed by the Space Shuttle. After a few decades, the shuttle program also helped to build the International Space Station that we know and love, and which has now seen over 25 years of continuous human presence in space. Now, because of that achievement, we've stayed very close to our home planet for more than half a century, and although we've used that time to figure out a lot of things and are generally much better at spaceflight these days, it was at the cost of not venturing even further out into the cosmos. But all that started to change a few years into the ISS's operations, and was sadly triggered by tragedy. After Shuttle Columbia broke up over Texas in 2003, NASA needed a focus beyond the Space Shuttle and the ISS. With human lives at risk each and every time the shuttle flew, the agency needed an overarching reason for the human spaceflight program to exist, a goal to work towards, something to inspire. In 2004, President George W. Bush ordered NASA to set its sights on sending humanity back to the moon for the first time since the early 70s, and thus the ill-fated Constellation program was born. Unfortunately, Constellation didn't get that far. For a while, it lurched along through many issues and even achieved one test flight of the Ares 1X vehicle in 2009, which was an early prototype of the shuttle SRB-based Ares 1 crew launcher. But it didn't get much further than that, as the Obama administration canceled the troubled program in 2010. We did, however, get the Orion capsule out of it, which was carried over into the Space Launch System, or SLS. This shuttle-derived launcher became the backbone of NASA's efforts to leave low Earth orbit, which in 2017, under the first Trump administration, turned into the Artemis program, with the goal of sending the first woman and first person of color to the moon. So as we've seen, the United States started seriously thinking about going back to the moon in the early years of the current century. But it was not, in fact, the only country thinking about the moon around that time. China, after its economy began to go into overdrive, also started to plan its own human return to the moon independently around the turn of the century, no doubt to showcase its rise as a technological powerhouse. The Chinese flew people and eventually small space stations into orbit with its Shenzhou program, which was created by Project 921 in 1992. It envisioned a spacecraft and, in time, a larger space station, which led to the current Tiangong space station. That's right, it started way back in 1992. A great example of Chinese long-term thinking in space. And that's all just the start of the country's space ambitions. So what are the Chinese doing to get to the moon? Well, they're working on the successor for their Shenzhou capsule, named Mengzhou, which roughly translates to dream vessel. This spacecraft will take up to 6 or 7 people in and beyond low Earth orbit. It's their moonship, and the accompanying human lander called Lanyue is also underway. As for the rocket set to launch these flagship missions, they've started advanced testing on their Changzheng 10 heavy lifter. In fact, the first Changzheng 10 first stage has already performed not 1, but 2 static fire tests, the last one occurring back in September of last year. They seem to be progressing well, and the rocket might even be ready to fly its first mission later this year. The partially reusable rocket will initially fly in a single-stick configuration to loft Mengzhou to low Earth orbit, but will later fly with 3 cores, much like Falcon Heavy. This configuration is spec'd to lift 70 tons to low Earth orbit and will give it the same capacity as the partially reusable New Glenn in its recently announced 9x4 configuration. This 3-core variant will be the one to finally take China to the moon, and it could fly as early as 2027. So the rocket seems to be well underway, but what about the other vehicles? Back in August, the Chinese completed a key test of its moonlander, Lanyue. During the test, it was hung under an apparatus while it tested its hypergolic-fueled landing engines. In Chinese, Lanyue means embracing the moon, and like the Apollo lunar module, it can carry 2 astronauts to and from the lunar surface with both a descent stage and an ascent stage. For comparison, the US's upcoming lunar landers plan to carry a crew of 4 and will consist of just one piece that will take the astronauts to the lunar surface and back up. Meanwhile, China's crew capsule Mengzhou has already completed several flight tests beginning as early as 2016. The 2016 test used a scale test vehicle, but they later flew a full-scale Mengzhou test spacecraft in 2020. Last year, Mengzhou performed a successful pad abort test, demonstrating that it can safely get away from an emergency on the launch pad. And on Wednesday, February 11th of this year, a first stage of the Chang'e 10 launched with a Mengzhou that successfully completed an abort test at max Q, followed by the stage making a soft landing in the ocean as a test prior to routine recoveries and reuse of the rocket. Now, to get to the moon, China will likely launch Mengzhou and Lanyue on separate Chang'e 10 launches. The two will make their way to the moon separately and then meet there for a lunar orbit rendezvous. A lot still needs to happen to make that work, but just last year, the China Manned Space Agency reported that it's still on track to get humans down to the lunar surface by 2030. Okay, but the US should be able to beat 2030 for a moon landing, right? So here's where things stand right now. NASA is about to send humans around the moon on Artemis II, but there may be a few more unknowns than you'd think. Of course, SLS and Orion have flown, but there's still a long way to go on other crucial pieces of the puzzle, including the lander. So let's take a look at all of the parts that need to come together to make that happen, starting with Orion, the capsule that will carry astronauts most of the way to the moon. This spacecraft has been around for a while now, and as mentioned, it survived the Constellation program, in which it was supposed to send people to and from the moon, and later to Mars. Orion made its first test flight into space on December 5th, 2014, lifting off on top of a Delta IV Heavy from Pad 37 at what was then called the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. That flight flew to high Earth orbit before splashing down off the coast of San Diego a few hours after launch. The Artemis rocket, known as the Space Launch System, or SLS, entered the picture after Constellation's cancellation. It was designed to combine as many shuttle components into a vehicle that wasn't the space shuttle. Its shuttle external tank-derived core is powered by 4 RS-25 Space Shuttle main engines, and the first few flights will actually use veteran engines of shuttle flights before switching to new builds on future missions. 2 shuttle-derived 5-segment solid rocket boosters flank SLS's core stage, and the whole thing is topped with an upper stage from the Delta IV program. In theory, using this much existing hardware should have cut costs and in fact sped up timelines to enable a first flight in 2017. But that year passed. Then 2018, then 2019, 2020, and 2021, and billions more were spent. Then finally, on November 16, 2022, SLS flew with Artemis I, an uncrewed mission with the Orion capsule going into a high retrograde orbit around the moon for a 24-day flight. The Orion capsule, making its second mission ever and its first mission with its European-built service module and full suite of systems, successfully completed its flight, gathering spectacular imagery along the way. There was a problem, though. After splashdown, NASA found some divots in Orion's heat shield. It had worn down much more than expected, eating into the capsule's valuable safety margins. This issue delayed the next flight while NASA studied the heat shield and came up with an interim solution to prevent a recurrence on Artemis II. A permanent fix is lined up for Artemis III and beyond. But NASA is now working towards launching Artemis II. SLS first rolled out to the pad mid-January, where teams made a few final preparations and put it through its paces with some final tests, including 2 wet dress rehearsal propellant load and practice countdowns before its planned launch. However, SLS ran into those pesky hydrogen leaks during the first wet dress rehearsal on February 2nd. Administrator Isaacman announced the following day that the February window was out and that Artemis II would try again in March if the second wet dress rehearsal went well. And lo and behold, on February 19th, the second wet dress rehearsal went much more smoothly than anyone dared to hope. The out-of-spec hydrogen leaks didn't reappear, and SLS was able to complete all of its objectives, including a recycle to T-minus 10 minutes at the 33-second mark in the count, then going down to T-minus 29 seconds for the final test. So, things were looking really good for a March attempt, but then came another issue, an issue with the Delta IV-derived ICPS upper stage. Helium stopped flowing properly through the stage, so the Artemis II stack needed to roll back to the hangar for repairs. No launch in March. On February 25th, the SLS made it back to the VAB, and the Artemis II launch is now slated for no earlier than April 1st. No April Fool in here. If Artemis I was anything to go by, they might end up needing a few more attempts before this rocket gets off the ground. But the countdown may also proceed just as smoothly as the second wet dress rehearsal. We'll just have to wait and see. Either way, in the near future, the 4 Artemis II astronauts will board Orion, which they've named Integrity, and prepare for liftoff. Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Cook, and mission specialist Jeremy Hansen will become the first humans to go to the moon in more than half a century. But Artemis II is not going to land on the moon. Rather, it's going to fly by in a lunar pass, not fully going into orbit around the moon. The whole mission is scheduled to last 10 days, during which the astronauts will first test their ship systems in high Earth orbit for close to 24 hours. If all tests go well, Integrity will separate from the SLS ICPS upper stage and conduct a proximity operations test with the spent stage for up to 2 hours to simulate approaching the lunar lander in space. Only then will Orion fire its engines for a multi-burn translunar injection process. Integrity will fly for roughly 4 days and go past the moon, getting as low as 6,513 kilometers altitude over its far side before slingshotting its way back to Earth. After 4 more days of flying, the capsule will separate from its European-built service module before re-entering the Earth's atmosphere for a splashdown off the Southern California coast. While unbelievably cool, none of that will bring us back to the moon's surface. The third prong of the Artemis program is, of course, the lunar lander, and that's where Starship comes in. SpaceX was awarded the Human Landing System, or HLS, contract for Starship in April of 2021, outbidding the Blue Origin-led national team and the Dynetics entry. Starship was the only option that NASA could afford at the time, as the other entries all had serious flaws or were seriously overpriced. After Blue Origin got its house in order, it also got an HLS contract for its Blue Moon Mark II human lunar lander for the Artemis V flight. Finally, Axiom Space is also developing a lunar spacesuit with its vacuum testing already underway. The suit's development also needs to be finished before a human landing can be attempted. And hey, do you want to stay up to date with all the progress of these systems? We regularly check in with the Artemis program on This Week in Spaceflight, released every Friday, and of course, we also have a whole series dedicated to Starship updates too. Subscribe to ensure that you don't miss it. For a long time, the first human lunar landing of the Artemis program was officially scheduled to fly in mid-2027. No one, and I mean no one, expected that date to hold. And indeed, we now know for certain that it won't happen that year, as NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman recently announced a rework of the whole Artemis program. Originally, the first Artemis mission, with boots on the moon, was slated to be Artemis III, but now that's been postponed to Artemis IV, inserting a mission between Artemis II and the lunar landing. That new Artemis III mission is still on schedule for 2027, but won't get anywhere near the moon. Instead, Artemis III is now going to be a low Earth orbit mission, with the Orion spacecraft docking to one or both of the commercial lunar landing contenders, the Starship-based HLS and Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark II. The astronauts will also test out Axiom's AX-EMU spacesuit on that flight. With this new flight profile, Artemis III is now the 21st century equivalent of Apollo 9. Launching on March 3, 1969, Apollo 9 followed the groundbreaking and historic Apollo 8 shot to the moon with a low Earth orbit mission. The mission's purpose was to test out the Apollo Command and Service Module with the lunar module and the Apollo spacesuit. The Apollo CSM, named Gumdrop, successfully docked to the lunar module, named Spider, and undocked, and docked again, while astronauts also tested the Apollo A7L spacesuit during spacewalks. But why would NASA change the whole Artemis program just a few years before the lunar landing? Well, they want to increase the cadence of flight in the program, and Isaacman noted that a launch every 3 years was not a pathway to success. The plan is to fly at least once a year, and aspirationally once every 10 months, though we'll see if that actually happens. The first Artemis lunar landing is now on schedule for early 2028 during Artemis IV. Isaacman stated that up to 2 landings could occur in 2028, with Artemis V possible for late that year, though that of course can and probably will be subject to change. To enable this increased cadence, the agency introduced a new version of SLS. The Block 1 configuration of SLS will be replaced with a near Block 1 standard configuration, and Block 1B with the Exploration Upper Stage will be shelved, along with its associated Mobile Launcher 2 currently under construction. The new standard configuration is thought to use the ULA Centaur 5, recently flown on Vulcan missions, in place of the Delta IV-based ICPS. Will all of this lead to a moon landing in 2028? Well, it's more likely than 2027 for sure, but there's still a good possibility that the Artemis IV lunar landing could be pushed back to 2029, 2030, 2031. Who knows? The reality is that the Starship-based human landing system, as well as the Blue Moon Mark II lander, are still nowhere near finished, and both are immensely complex. Any delays to those programs could push a landing even later. How much later? We're not sure, but the Starship program has had, well, more than its fair share of issues, especially with the Block II ship's first few flights. Block 3 was supposed to get things in order, but then the first Block 3 booster popped during initial testing at Massey's, and that was testing that didn't even involve cryogenics. Those issues will be ironed out, but let's see how Block 3 performs starting sometime in the first half of this year. A whole lot depends on how those first Block 3 flights go, and especially how orbital refueling goes, which needs to work before Starship can go to the moon. What's more, an uncrewed Starship HLS demo landing must be completed before Artemis IV can even be attempted. Of course, the revamped Artemis program takes this into account, but the timeline is still very aggressive, and there's a lot that can still go wrong. While SpaceX continues to work on Starship, Blue Origin unveiled its first Blue Moon Mark I lander to fly, which will be processed for flight sometime soon, possibly in the first half of this year. Blue Moon Mark I isn't crewed, but it is the basis of the crewed Mark II lander, and there's some chatter about possibly modifying Mark I to accommodate crew for a quicker lunar landing if Starship falters further. All the while, China seems to be on track, as far as we can tell, for a 2030 human lunar landing with its Mengzhou Orion-equivalent capsule and Lanyue human lander. Many in Washington believe that China could very well beat the United States back to the moon, and they're in a position to know. In fact, former NASA administrator and current lobbyist Jim Bridenstine stated, quote, "Unless something changes, it is highly unlikely that the United States will beat China's projected timeline." Astronaut and former ISS commander Terry Virts also stated that it was very possible China could absolutely win. But is there anything to win? Are the US and China even in a race to the moon at all? Both countries started their current lunar programs for their own reasons, not as a reaction to each other's ambitions. China didn't make plans as a direct response to Artemis, but rather with its own goals to show that it could be the next global superpower. Likewise, Artemis didn't start as a response to China's lunar program either. Yet, the current plans have repeatedly been framed as a race. Since last year, the first year of Trump's second term, there's been a lot of chatter about a new moon race with China and how the US must be first. All of this even as the administration proposed a large budget cut to NASA and nominated, then pulled, then nominated again, Jared Isaacman as NASA administrator. Yeah, even NASA's permanent leadership was on a yo-yo string. In the meantime, NASA was run by acting administrator Sean Duffy, who also happens to be the Secretary of Transportation. All the while, China proceeded with its human lunar program in the shadows, but again, not necessarily racing with the US per se. The Chinese government just tends to engage in long-term thinking to a greater extent than Western societies. But now the chaos around NASA's leadership has since resolved, with Jared starting in his new job leading the agency late last year, and he seems to be set on making the US win.
We'll do it for America, for humankind, and in doing so, we will inspire the world and generations to follow to take us even farther. We are just getting started on the greatest adventure in human history, and with urgency and purpose and extreme focus on the mission, NASA will lead the way.
Now, all of this talk about a race to the moon actually predates the current administration, and former NASA Administrator Bill Nelson even stated that the US was in fact in a race with China during his time as administrator under President Biden. He even warned about the dangers of China using a permanent presence on the moon to claim resource-rich areas as sovereign territory. There's a lot of concern about China being able to set the rules of the future if they do get to the moon before the US. So, Moon Race 2.0? Not so fast. For one thing, as previously mentioned, China doesn't appear to be treating this as a race. Secondly, the Outer Space Treaty, passed in the 60s and now signed on by all major superpowers, including China, prohibits territorial claims in space. It's a lot like Antarctica, which is also protected by an international treaty that all of the major powers signed. Even if China did somehow decide to flout the Outer Space Treaty, there would be blowback and major repercussions. All sides, including China, would have a lot to lose if tensions over the moon resulted in a major war. If NASA were somehow able to beat China back to the moon with Artemis IV, yet the Artemis program were to still end like Apollo with no moon base, whereas China did end up building an international moon base, which it plans to do by the way, well, that wouldn't really feel like much of a victory now, would it? So the important thing is how NASA follows through after Artemis IV lands. A permanent NASA moon base would be a far greater signal of American commitment to space exploration than a flags and footprints Apollo redo, no matter what China does. The real defeat in this scenario would be if NASA didn't follow through and build that moon base. Of course, NASA plans to stay on the moon. Just this week, they announced an agency-wide overhaul of programs focusing on making a moon base happen and looking ahead to exploration beyond the moon. The changes spell the end for the Lunar Gateway space station to make room for an outpost on the lunar surface. The message seems clear. NASA wants to return to the moon and stay. It's now up to the government to provide the funding and long-term support to make it happen. Other countries, like India, are also interested in sending people to the moon, and Europe and Japan will send their own astronauts alongside NASA's as part of the Artemis program. So it's unlikely that China alone will have a significant impact on what everyone else does, or doesn't do, on the lunar surface. There is, of course, precedent for the US losing a race, only to go on to bigger and better things. The Soviet Union, for example, launched the first satellite, Sputnik, the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, and Alexei Leonov conducted the first spacewalk from Voskhod in 1965. They also had the first successful moon probe in 1959, the first successful robotic soft landing on the moon in 1966, and the first lunar rover, Lunokhod, in 1970. The USSR was beating America soundly in the early 1960s, but all was not as it appeared. America caught up with the Gemini program and kept going with Apollo. Not that many people even remember most of the Soviet achievements, but how many people talk about Apollo 11, even now? Even if only to throw some lame conspiracy shade on it. In contrast, how many people remember that the Soviet Union launched the first space station, Salyut 1? Not that many. How many people remember the aforementioned Lunokhod rovers or the Luna sample return missions, one of which successfully flew in 1976, 4 years after the last Apollo mission in December of 1972? Again, not that many. But how many people remember the Space Shuttle? Lots, right? The shuttle was still used by Hollywood as America's ride to space long after it retired, and today there's even controversy about whether the Space Shuttle Discovery should remain in Virginia or be moved to Houston. But how many people remember the Soviet shuttle Buran? Almost nobody. How many people know about the ISS? Lots. Now, the Soviets did have international cooperation, including the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975, as well as intercosmos missions to the Salyut space stations involving the Warsaw Pact or other Soviet allied countries. And those missions are no doubt remembered in the countries that were involved. The USSR launched the Mir space station and assembled it, and after the Cold War ended, NASA started flying shuttles and astronauts to the complex as part of ramping up its space station operations, learning how to fly for long durations repeatedly before the ISS started assembly in 1998. Yet, the ISS remains the triumph of space stations and international cooperation in space. Regardless of whether it's the US or China that lands the next people on the moon, it does appear that humanity is setting up for a permanent return there, complete with scientific bases. NASA and the US can maintain a leading role if they accomplish that goal, which Isaacman said would happen, which is a good sign, and then continue to work towards sending people to Mars, even if the next person on the moon happens to be an astronaut with the China Manned Space Agency wearing a Chinese flag on their spacesuit. Now, if China beats America back to the moon, but America builds a moon base and then becomes the first country to land someone on Mars, and especially if SpaceX does succeed in building the first Mars colony with Starships, then who will be remembered the most? I suppose that'll also depend on what China does, but the point is that all will not be lost if the US loses this so-called moon race that might not actually be a race at all. So what do you think? Are the US and China in a race for the moon? Does it even matter? Let us know in the comments. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, with a reminder that in some races, all that really matters is what comes next.